Our program today is on the importance of pollinators and how to attract them to your garden by Jessica Miller. It is sponsored by the Kelodale Garden Club of the Edina Garden Council. The Edina Garden Council's projects include the Friday and Saturday, May 2023 plant sale to be held at Arneson Acres Park in Edina. The public is invited to attend. The Edina Garden Council also contributes to scholarships for horticulture students. Our Edina Garden Council projects have included Edina City Park beautification projects, such as raising the funding for the fountain at Arneson Acres Park. We also donate to the gazebo and the Tranquility Garden at Arneson Acres Park, making those features available for the park. The Kelodale Garden Club is one of 5 garden clubs affiliated with the Edina Garden Council. Each club in the EGC plants one of the City of Edina gardens. Kelodale Garden Club's garden is located at the City of Edina Fire Station on Tracy Avenue. Projects that the Kelodale Garden Club financially supports include noxious weed abatement and habitat restoration at Lake Cornelia Park in Edina. The Kelodale Garden Club raises funding to have the Minnesota Native Landscapes Company remove buckthorn and other noxious weeds there. The Kelodale Garden Club then scatters Minnesota native wildflower seeds in the areas where noxious weeds have been removed. All native plantings are either raised from seed or scattered from seed to reduce the possibility of transmission of jumping worms in the natural areas. It is a great honor to introduce entomologist Jessica Miller to speak about the importance of pollinators and how to attract them to your garden. Ms. Miller holds a MS in entomology from the University of Minnesota with a specialization in aquatic plants. She has her own consulting business called Dragon's Wind, for which she travels throughout the United States. There she works with aquatic environments, including how stormwater moves and its ability to infiltrate soils and impact the health of area waters. She also educates the public on insect science, including pollinators. Jessica has also worked for the University of Minnesota Bee Lab, the Metropolitan Mosquito Control District, and the Cedar Creek Research Station. Jessica is a certified master water steward for the Minnehaha Watershed District and the Freshwater Society. She is a member of Metro Blooms, where she served on the board of directors. She is also a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution Monument Chapter, where she serves as the conservation chair. Her other organizations include the Society for Freshwater Science, the Great River Greening. Jessica is also a weaver and artist who designs insect-themed jewelry. Welcome, Jessica Miller.
What a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much, Diane, for the lovely introduction. I sure have a lot of fun with insects, love traveling, and I'm excited to share what I know today with you. Some of the topics that I thought I'd cover today, and they're going to be each within the context of different insects, is diversity. The more the merrier. Diversity not only in our insects, but also in the different environments, moisture regimes, different shade, sun, the diversity in plants. As I go through some of the insects, we'll talk about bee tongues and how the flowers match those bee tongues and how to watch for bee tongues. We'll also cover where the Hymenoptera, which are bees, ants, and wasps, where they're nesting and how to encourage nesting habitats. And then I do cover throughout the presentation some of the specific plants that are beneficial to these insects. Now, before I get into the heavy duty pollinators, didn't want to leave out some information about beetles. And since I know I'm going to get very carried away into the bees and butterflies, thought I'd start with talking about lightning beetles. Diane and I were talking that she was pretty pleased with having lightning beetles in her environment, in her garden, and asked if I knew what she might be doing to make them so successful. Well, lightning beetle babies, or the larvae, live in moist conditions, and they're also dependent on eating snails and slugs. So when we manage our environments for some of these pests that cause damage to environments we've been working hard on, sometimes the removal of those removes some of the other insects we want to see. So we want to encourage the slugs and snails in that wet environment, and those will feed the lightning beetles that then will show up in your yards. I thought this would be a good part to say, like fungi and different pesticides, if you're using fungicides, that will remove some of the fungi that are connected to different environments, kind of complete that ecosystem. Reduction of different herbicides, pesticides, fungicides will also leave that environment open to some of the animals we may not be aware of how they're benefiting the full ecosystem with our delightful pollinators. I've got the website for the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. They do firefly walks. They're doing nighttime programming for fireflies or lightning beetles. I recommend looking at their website to find those dates and potentially go and observe those beautiful insects flying at night. If the Landscape Arboretum is a little far from you, there's also another spot where you can see the lightning beetles put on their fabulous displays, and that's Coldwater Spring, right near Minnehaha Falls along the Mississippi River. Another beautiful spot to see fireflies in display. So I didn't want to end just with fireflies or the lightning beetles, which are in the order Coleoptera, which are beetles. And I wanted to share a couple other beetles that I've seen in my yard that add to that ecosystem. So the picture on the left is a red milkweed beetle. They do eat milkweed plants, generally don't harm them enough to ruin their seed set or anything. In fact, I got the milkweed beetle long before the monarch showed up to eat the milkweed. So that was fun. Their red color is also from eating the milkweed plants like monarch butterflies. So it's kind of fun to put together these red colors, see the similarities of what they're eating and how that presents in their color displays. The middle beetle is a flower beetle. This one is actually dead. I positioned it so that I could get a nice photo. If you look, you can see it's kind of hairy. Presumably flower beetle means it's on flowers, and maybe those hairs help it pick up pollen, and it does provide some pollination services. And then the yellow and black beetle on the far right is a locust borer. Often we'll see those on goldenrod in the fall. Because they're crawling around on flowers, there is that potential that they are pollinating. But again, these insects are part of that greater ecosystem, and sometimes they may be benefiting bees in ways that I haven't quite figured out yet. This last beetle I wanted to share with you is a blister beetle. And I was just looking at the information last year, and it turns out blister beetles complete their life cycle in bumblebee nests. So I was shocked to learn that you're not supposed to touch them because they do have a noxious acid that they'll release that may cause you to blister or have skin irritation. But finding that these are connected to bumblebees just blew my mind, because I wouldn't have really associated this insect with bumblebees or with other pollinators. So I'll keep doing exploring and hopefully have some more information about insects that connect to these pollinators, like one of my favorites, the bumblebees. My last beetle is the lady beetles. The reason I really like lady beetles is they eat aphids. So I have had this idea that aphids are horrible and disgusting and terrible. Must get them off the landscape. Well, I do not grow soybeans for a living, so they're not quite as detrimental to my landscape as if that was my source of income. The picture on the left is a lady beetle larva. They're very mobile and will crawl around on your plants, eating lots of aphids and other soft-bodied insects. This photo is one of my favorites because not only does it have a beetle predator, and both the larva and the adult, like in the photo on the right side, will eat aphids and help manage those populations. But if you look closely on the photo on the left, you'll see the green aphids. There's a few different sizes, some smaller, some larger. And then there are brown aphids. And what has happened here is there is a tiny, tiny, tiny wasp that lays her egg inside of a living aphid. It'll interrupt the food and eat all the food that the aphid thinks it's getting, continue its development, and when it pupates, it releases a chemical that makes the aphid harden into this perfect little protective encasement for that little tiny wasp to complete its development, pupate, emerge as an adult, chew a little hole in the aphid wall, crawl out, mate, and do it again. So if you see these little brown cocoons. They call them aphid mummies. That means you've got the little tiny wasps that are helping make sure your aphid populations don't go too crazy. So there's a little bit about the beetles. This slide is to show the diversity of insects. I believe there are closer and closer to 1 million described species of insects now. And of course, there are multiples of each of those species. So plenty of diversity to invite into your gardens. Quick overview of an insect. Insects have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. The head is going to include the antenna, or they're kind of the chemical receptors of insects, how they smell or detect things they need to find to complete their life cycle or to make healthy babies. Antenna, eyes, and mouth parts. If you look at the ant figure on the bottom left, on the head, there are 2 compound eyes, and then the 3 dots on the middle of its head are actually light detecting organs or additional eyes that mostly just detect the light, but not actually shapes. Insects also have 2 pairs of wings that will attach, as well as the legs, onto that thorax. The abdomen tends to have the digestive and reproductive organs. Insects go through one of 2 forms of development, the holometabolous or complete metamorphosis, which includes a pupation phase. So the eggs will hatch into larvae. In this example, it's lady beetle, and it has a mobile larva. As it'll grow and molt, then before it becomes an adult, it'll have a pupa. So it'll make a case for itself to protect it while it changes from the larva into adult. And then the adult will emerge from that pupa. It will be sexually mature, be able to mate, and then lay the eggs again. The insects that go through this life cycle include the butterflies and moths, flies, and beetles. Incomplete metamorphosis is the other way that insects will go through their development, and that just does not have the pupation phase. So from the eggs, a nymph will emerge. Generally, those nymphs are going to look almost exactly like what the adults will look like, except either with the wings growing and developing as it molts. So each time it molts, its wing buds will get a little bit bigger. If you notice, just before the 5th molt, these lighter green parts between the head and the abdomen are where the wings are developing. For a grasshopper on its 5th molt, then its wings will be fully developed and it'll be sexually mature to mate and then lay eggs again. The insects that go through this type of metamorphosis will be crickets, grasshoppers, true bugs like the spit bug, which is hidden in the spit there in that center picture. On the top and bottom picture are both true bugs. The top one is a nymph without its wings fully developed. And then the bottom one is a leaf bug. And it does have its wings fully developed, though they are folded over its back. So then that is a quick overview of what insects are. And then like us, insects need clean air, clean water, and food and habitat. And so the meat and potatoes of this presentation, we'll talk about how you put those items into your landscape and invite those insects in. So I talked about diversity being really important. This image I thought would be helpful about thinking about water diversity in your landscape. So this one happens to be a rain garden. It's an area where we tend to want to attract our water, have it infiltrate into the soil instead of moving over the landscape. So that might be an area that's going to be a little more moist. Of course, on the top where it's filtering in will be a little drier. Lawn tends to be a little different than the vegetation. So if you think about the bottom of this rain garden, I know I tend to have all of my leaves either blow or I put my leaves there. So the layer of leaf litter there will keep it more moist as well. The leaf litter is really helpful for habitat and fungi, lots of animals that'll get in there and eat those things. I also like this image because it's got trees. You think about the shade that trees provide or the sunshine areas where the shade doesn't hit. And those are going to be diverse areas that these insects are able to find what they need in that environment. The other complication is all of the connections within our ecosystem and trying to think about what they are, exploring how they interact, and sometimes you can find a little bit more joy in an animal you might not expect. The simple food web image I really like because it has a mouse and an owl. I would love a fox and a coyote in there too, because mice have become one of my favorite animals, especially once they've left, because mice holes or rodent burrows are really valuable for bumblebees. I'll talk more about that in just one second. But I like the owl because we're dependent on the owl eating that mouse, taking the mouse away, but leaving the rodent burrow so that we can have more bumblebee nests. Bumblebee nests can be found in lots of areas in your environment. They specifically do really like rodent burrows. Bumblebees don't dig their own nests out, so they're dependent on animals like mice to dig out their nests and then abandon them for one reason or another, and then they can occupy it. And one of the wild things about insects, I talked about the antenna being chemical receptors or sort of a nose for insects. Bumblebees, it turns out, can find abandoned rodent burrows because they can smell the pee and poop of the mice. Not just be able to detect those smells, but can detect old smells because it would prefer an abandoned burrow to an occupied burrow. It can tell when those scents have gotten a little bit older. Isn't that just wild? Bumblebees can also nest in grass clumps. So when you've got those really nice, some of the native grasses are kind of clumping grasses, and they'll make tufts. And the bumblebee queens, when they come out and find it, they might have just the perfect place to start her nest. And then as the new grass grows in, we'll keep it protected and they'll be able to be successful in that nesting habitat. You may have found a nest in your compost pile. Sometimes your compost pile has a real nice cavity. That'd be a perfect size for a nice bumblebee nest. Can be less fun than when you're divvying out your compost into your yard. And then garages, under your steps, under rock piles. So, and then I just talked about bumblebee nests, and here's a picture of an example. This nest was used at the University of Minnesota in research. It was a managed colony. The queen is in the front. You can see she's going to be the largest in her nest. The honey pots are filled with either nectar or pollen. The queen bee is in charge of when the nest starts off, and then eventually all of her daughters will take care of filling those and also taking care of the babies and keeping the nest clean. So the pots that are open, some of it you can see reflections in it. That would be reflecting probably off of the nectar. They don't reduce the moisture content, so it's not quite as thick as honey is. So it'll be a little runnier, but that's how they store it, similar to honeybees. Kind of in that top left, you see their honey pots or the pots have been covered over it. That means there's larvae in those, actually would be pupa at this point. So they're completing their development and then will emerge as adults and the daughter helpers, and they'll begin taking care of the nest and taking over some more of those duties if they're the first to emerge in the first daughters to come out. So to be a little bit more clear about how the bumblebees go through their life cycle, is right now all our bumblebees are still staying cozy underneath the snow, possibly under leaf litter, maybe dug down. Like in this example, it looks like she's in a little cavity, not underneath the frost line, but kind of within that soil area that's freezing hard. And the way she can get away with that is her blood changes. It gets rid of the water content and turns into an antifreeze. So she will freeze, but it won't be the water freezing, which destroys cells and living organisms. So not too much longer, or maybe too much longer, depending on how much snow we get, right? She will be coming out this spring, and when she comes out, she's been mated in the fall, so she's ready to find the perfect spot to begin her nest. She'll start looking for food, then she'll lay some eggs, continue to collect resources, and then she'll lay females first. So then her daughters will come out and start helping first in the nest. And then as they get older, then they'll start leaving the nest to collect the resources to help raise more sisters. Then as the season progresses, the queen will lay male eggs. Eventually, everybody leaves the nest and everybody will pass except for the new queen and the males. When they will mate, the old queen will die. The new queens will find their overwintering spot and starting it again. The queens are much larger, so I'm getting pretty excited for them to come out this spring. I wanted to remind us that bumblebees are part of the Hymenoptera, bees, ants, and wasps. So honeybees and bumblebees. Honeybees are the European honeybees, not native to North and South America at all. And then bumblebees are really the social bees that we have in Minnesota. So bumblebees are the native social bee we've got. A few are partially social, but I won't get confusing right now. So honeybees are social. I loved when I learned when you have one honeybee on your flower, that's really neat, but the whole organism is actually the thousands of bees and the queen and the drones. That is the whole organism. So only one bee is like one cell to this social organism. Then in our social wasps, it's really paper wasps, the yellow jackets, which can nest in the ground and the cracks in the sidewalk and things, and bald-faced hornets. Those are the social wasps. And that's it for social animals. The reason that I mention how few social insects we have is often they're the ones that can kind of ruin a time outside. And it's because when one of them stings you, they have a colony of others that want to protect that nest as well. So there's a couple ones that when you find their homes, they get awfully frustrated and try to defend it and make you go away. But otherwise, most of our insects are going to be solitary. We're going to go through a few bumblebee pictures I have, and then the flowers that they're on, thinking about how to invite them in. So this was my new bumblebee of 2022. It's called Bombus citrinus. I was having a real hard time identifying it and got some help. So that one was a new photo for me. This insect is world milkweed. There was this beautiful big patch where I was doing some research. So it's really fun to see the world milkweed doing so well out in nature. There's a little beetle kind of hidden up in the top left. You can see its antenna. I don't know what kind it is. It has very long antenna. This bumblebee is also kind of interesting because they don't make their own nest. This bumblebee doesn't make its own nest. It will nest and have its babies reared in another bumblebee's nest. Think of it as another way you can tell your ecosystem is being robust. If you have enough bumblebees for this bee to sneak in and make her babies, that's a good sign that you've got a robust population of bumblebees, and the next level, the ones that are taking advantage of how well they're doing. This is our Minnesota state bumblebee, is the rusty patch or Bombus affinis. This sweet bee was in my yard in 2014. I have not seen this species in my yard since, in South Minneapolis, a nice urban landscape. Joe pieweed is the plant that this bumblebee is on. Joe pieweed is a great bumblebee plant, sometimes a little high for different areas. The way you identify the rusty patch, if you follow the black up the abdomen to the first colored patch, yellow, it's got a bright yellow or a lemony yellow outline, and then sort of that rusty patch in the center of that. That's one way to tell the rusty patch bumblebee. Now this one has a nice bright orange patch. There's a Bombus rufosinctus, or the red belted bumblebee. It's sometimes mistaken for the rusty patch because it's got that bright orange color. This one is on onion. And then a couple of my favorite plants. Solomon's seal is a great plant for bumblebees. You can see the sweet little bumblebee hanging upside down on the flowers here. Bumblebees do buzz pollination. And what makes that special is as this bumblebee hangs upside down from this flower, she'll disengage her wing muscles and then flex the muscles. So it makes a higher buzzing noise. You might park next to some Solomon seal and listen to the variation as the bee flies in. You'll hear one tone. When she lands and buzzes to release the pollen, she'll make a little higher pitched buzz. The pollen falls down onto her body and then she'll clean it. And if you look real carefully, you can kind of see a little yellow nugget, and that's on her hind leg. And that's where she'll collect that pollen and then pack it together and put it in her little saddlebags on her hind legs to bring home. Prairie smoke is another flower that bumblebees are specifically built to get that pollen from. So again, you'll see on the left, the bumblebee hanging upside down from the flower. She'll again do that buzz pollinations, disengage the wings from attaching to the muscles, shiver those muscles, and the pollen will fall down on her, and then she can gather it off her hairs and bring it back to the nest. I'm not certain that this picture shows a great example, but when these flowers have been pollinated, they stand straight up. So I love visual clues to when somebody's done the work. This photo I did borrow. I have not witnessed bumblebees on my prairie smoke just yet, but I know they're being pollinated because they continue to come upright after somebody's visited them. The other thing I get so excited to see on the prairie smoke plants is picture on the left, the top of the flower. If you can see my mouse moving, you will get other bees that'll come in that can't get to the nectar or to the pollen, so it'll cheat and bite holes. Bees have great jaws, so they'll chew little holes to sneak in the back way, won't do the pollination service, but will get those rewards from the flowers. So I like looking for cheater bee signs because I love playing detective work. I hope that this talk today helps you find those clues and watch your flowers and insects. So after all, I've talked about how few of the social bees or wasps we have. So most of our pollinators are going to be solitary. Here's a nice slide put together by Heather Holm with green metallic bees, which I've been obsessed with looking at, the shiny green bees. The next image is a leafcutter bee. I like these bees. They store the pollen on their bellies. And so if you notice, she's got her abdomen tilted upwards because she's filling the hairs underneath with pollen. And as it gets filled, she has to lift her abdomen higher and higher to not knock off all the resources she's just collected. The other fun thing about the leafcutter bees, mine are real fond of tiny maple volunteers I've got growing in the yard. And they'll absolutely cut these beautiful round holes out of those leaves, again, leaving me to be detective to notice that they're making nests out of some of the plant material I've got. Mining bees and plaster bees are just another couple of solitary bees that are out, black and white, doing their pollination services. So then another piece to look for is bee tongues. So this is a few different images. On the far left is a bee with her tongue out, and it looks like she's got a hairy tongue. I haven't learned if that means she can pick up more than just nectar, that she picks up pollen with that tongue. I'm not certain. The middle photo is a bumblebee. I've been having a blast looking back over some of my bumblebee photos. Turns out they'll fly with their tongues hanging out. I don't know if it's time saving instead of tucking it in and pulling it out every time, or if possibly they can actually detect the nectar in the flower by having those tongues out. It increases the sensitivity to detecting whether that floral nectar is there or not. And then on the right side is a honeybee being used in some research. They were testing how the tongue would go out if it was a sugar substance or a salt substance to see how quickly their tongues would come out to detect what their resources needs are. So again, that picture on the left is that same tongue from the previous slide. Thinking about how that tongue is getting to where it needs to in the flower. Like, it just kind of blows my mind to think of how complex flowers are and the bees that have co-evolved with them. But you can also see her hind leg being full of pollen. It's a nice bright yellow pollen here, kind of dark yellow orange pollen, and she's packing it in on her legs to take back to the nest for provisions. And in fact, if you look closely at her, she's kind of coated with pollen all over the place. And then we'll groom that off and then be able to store it on her legs as well. The green bee on the right side is on Azizias, on Golden Alexander, and her little tongue is going into that flower to get the resources. So even the long tongues can go in short flowers at times. Then we've got penstemon here, and I'm not certain how that affects the tongue length, but I know that bee size and the pollination can be a clue to who is pollinating the flower and who is getting the rewards without the pollination services. So down at the bottom, you can see a bumblebee here. She's going to fill up that whole flower. As she enters into that flower, she's touching every aspect of the inside of that flower. So wherever the pollen is for that, that's going to get on that bumblebee. And when she gets to the next flower, she'll be doing those pollination services to help that plant continue its life cycle. I have also seen itty bitty bees go inside. They're not going to be touching the whole part of that flower, so they won't be as effective for pollinating. And then I believe penstemon, if you look, there are little hairs that have little sticky things at the end. And I believe this prevents ants from being sneaky cheater insects to getting the resources. So sometimes those sticky bits, the insect will get caught on those and won't be able to get loose, and so won't be stealing the nectar resources that this flower is trying to bring in bumblebees to get that seed set. This bee is specifically a golden Alexander bee, so she's going to get all the resources from only this plant. So she's a specialist. She's going to need the pollen from the zizia, from the golden Alexander. If you notice on her hind leg, it's a paler pollen than in that last example. Is a little more golden. This one's a paler yellow, presumably reflecting the pollen from the golden Alexander. So some bees are going to be specialists on a specific flower. Others are going to be dependent on multiple flowers and multiple blooms throughout the season to get all of the resources they'll need. Couple more. I brought in these pictures, another penstemon photo in the top left, and then the other two images are spotted bee balm, Narda punctata, which is one of my favorites because of its wasp that it attracts. But I wanted to show some other insects on the plants. Certain plants can attract multiple pollinators, even if they're specialists for some of them. These are a couple of green bees. There's sweat bees. Left, it's on a coneflower. You can also see pictured the liatris. And then the bee above is on an aster. Here's a picture of a leafcutter bee. I believe that's a clover. You can also see a little beetle perched on that flower. And then this is another leafcutter bee on butterfly milkweed. I'm going to go a little fast because I wanted to get to the butterflies as well. This is a bee. I originally was giving a presentation and called it a wasp. To my embarrassment, that's okay. I can be wrong and learn things too. This is kind of like the Bombus citrinus where we get excited. This bee does not make her own nest. She's dependent on going into other bee nests and laying her eggs. So they will rear her babies out for her. I get so excited because it means I have bees enough to support this insect to have her babies too. So then wasps. I get really excited because I'm having so much fun getting into discovering wasps. There's so many of them, and as I get my diversity in plants increased, the wasps are finding them. And it cheers me up that they're solitary. They tend to be less aggressive than those social wasps. I get excited in spring also to keep an eye on some of the wasps if they start building nests in places that are unfortunate, to go and knock them down when they're small. In the autumn is not the right time to be attacking great big populated wasp nests. This is just a sweet example of photos that I've got. The bottom center is a northern paper wasp, is native to Minnesota, and then the rest I believe are solitary wasps. This is a great book if you want to continue discovering some wasps by Heather Holm. And then this great black wasp on the spotted bee balm is one reason I just love spotted bee balm, because this wasp is all black. If you look closely on any one of those photos, you're going to see some light yellow coloration. That's where the spotted bee balm deposits its pollen onto this insect. And then when she goes to the next flower, it'll deposit more pollen and pick up the pollen. So I love seeing the telltale signs that pollination is happening. Another sweet picture. Some of the antennae are really fun to notice how they're moving around. They're often hunting. So wasps eat nectar for themselves. So when you see them on flowers, it's because they are hungry. When you see them on leaves like this, probably they're hunting for something to capture and bring to the nest for provisions for their baby, for the larvae who are carnivorous. Another picture, this wasp is on the golden Alexander, another insect happy to use the resources on that plant. There's a bee wolf on goldenrod. It's another insect attracted to these flowers in the fall time. And then bee nest. As much as bamboo can be such a delight to use, bamboo is not native to Minnesota. I like using the resources we have that grow here. What I want you to notice in these photos, even though I thought these are going to be too short, too wide, these, I believe, are all occupied by a wasp. I believe it's a sand wasp that uses kind of mud to cap off the bamboo stakes. This example, unlike the first one that I experimented with, which was only about 3 inches deep, it's got longer pieces of bamboo in it, and the diversity in the capping of these bamboo pieces helped show that I was attracting more than just one type of species within it. So let me pull up the close-up here. So if you look, there's kind of a beige one that looks kind of sandy. That's going to be a different insect than the ones next to it, where it looks more like resins. So different bee, I presume these are all bees this time instead of wasps with that resin collecting. And when they cap off the end, it means that they filled the bamboo tubes with an egg, with provisions, and then sell it off. By sell it off, I mean create kind of the bedroom chambers. Got another example of a nest I'll show. So then here's an example of our native plants and these little bitty bees that will nest within those stems. So when you get into cleaning up your gardens, whether it's in the fall or in the spring, I try to leave some of the plant matter behind, because these stem nesting bees will either use the hollowed out stem or hollow out a stem and create those nests within that. And here is an example of how they nest in the lower portion. That's a bamboo stick. Each of those pupa cases are individual chambers that then have those bees within them developing. The larger cases are going to be females. They lay the males last. Usually the males are first to emerge from those stems. If they don't emerge, if they're not successful, those females will eat right through them. So it's also to the advantage of having the females in the back. So in case anybody is trying to get their way out and eating through them, they're eating through the males first and leave those valuable females alone. Well, I think this one is bone set. I've been kind of interested at the variety of stems and the ability to nest in them. If you look at the square stem on the bottom left, it's a mint family. I thought those were going to be too wimpy. They kind of rot easily and go back to the earth fairly fast. But it turns out sometimes that's just enough time for those bees to develop within them. There also be bees that nest in the ground. Bare patches or wood chips are really great for those to find their nests. So then other pollinators of great importance are the butterflies and moths. This one I absolutely love, because if you look really carefully at her feet, you can see the pollinia stuck onto her feet. This pollinia is from milkweed plants. In fact, at times, honeybees will get too many pollinia stuck on their feet, and they'll end up stuck to a milkweed plant and unable to escape the way they pollinate. On the bottom left is an example of the kind of barbells with the sticky part that'll get caught on these animals and then bring it to the next plant for pollination. We need different pollinators to help these plants do well enough to feed the monarch butterflies. And then here's a couple of monarch butterflies. I just learned that the males coming up from Mexico, the smaller ones will mate first. It may be a temperature thing that the smaller males will be ready for mating sooner. And maybe it means that then larger males that have to fly up to Texas or further have the robust wings to fly further, and the littler ones don't have to fly as far. Anyways, there's advantages to being small and there's advantages to being large. We'll keep piecing it out. And the picture on the right side is actually two male monarchs. I took a picture. It's kind of hard to tell what they're doing, but they look like they were wrestling each other. And so I looked very carefully, got some photos, and when I realized they were both males, I was curious to what that meant. Was it battling and the winner would be the male who actually got a mate? I'm not exactly sure what was going on. Always something new happening in nature to pay attention to and research and find out. American ladies lay their eggs and the caterpillars will eat pussy toes or pearly everlasting. Red admirals, their host plants can be nettles, wood nettles, and hops. Mourning cloaks are going to overwinter as adults. And so that duff layer is really important. And when they come out, sometimes they'll look a little rough around the edges because they're crawling out from the leaf litter. Another first spring animal that I like to watch for. Skipper butterflies get really exciting for me because their host plants are grasses. So I've been getting pretty excited to diversify and try out different grasses in my yard and see which different skippers will come and show up. The typical wing position is like this little guy right here. So it's kind of fun to see the way they hold their wings. I'm not exactly sure of what advantage that is. Maybe it makes them bigger and makes them look less delicious to eat. Thinking about butterfly tongues and the plants for butterflies versus bee tongues, I think is really fascinating. The butterflies have those delightfully long proboscis tongues, as you can see in the left picture. This is just another skipper, the Indian skipper. Its host plant is little blue stem. And then I really wanted to make sure I got to the swallowtails because I finally saw a butterfly pollinating. Say that, well, how are they pollinating? It just doesn't seem like you see them covered in pollen all that often. Well, in the photo on your left, it's on a tiger lily here. And if you look, she's got pollen kind of along where her orange and blue dots are on her wings. So I was watching the butterfly hang from the lilies and seeing those pollinia bonk her on her wings again in those spots. And the next flower, it's going to bonk her on her wings, leaving pollen behind and taking pollen with. So I was really excited to see the plants that butterflies are potentially co-evolved with to do that pollination services. I presume bumblebees would definitely not be as good at this because it doesn't have those long wings to run into those pollen bundles. Here I've got another close-up of that tiger swallowtail and that pollen transfer. As she's getting the nectar from the plant is using her mobility to help the next generation of those flowers. That covers what I really wanted to get through today with you. I hope it's inspired some visual thoughts as you get out in your gardens or imagine ourselves out in our gardens. Some examples of some flowers that are helpful to specific insects.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica, for this excellent program. You had beautiful slides and such interesting information. We'll have you stop your screen sharing now. I will go back here. All right, we'll take some questions in the chat. Let's see if we have anything. I have a question that I know a lot of people are interested in. Some people would like to raise monarch butterflies or a swallowtail. You find a caterpillar in your garden. Should you take that caterpillar, and they sell these tents that you can keep them in and feed them? Do you recommend that they do that? Do they do better if you rear them, or do they do better in the wild?
So from what I understand with the research is they do better in the wild, even though it can be really hard on us. There's a lot of them that will die that get eaten. Nature happens to them. Oftentimes we want to take them in and help them. And it really is domesticating them, especially if you're bringing them from outside to inside your homes. It's going to change how they're sensing what they should be doing in their development. Now, if you've never reared a monarch caterpillar, I think the value of watching them go through their development is really neat. So maybe one or two or something like that if you've never done it. But mostly we really do need to encourage nature and plant more milkweed and let those animals continue out in the nature so that they can keep contributing to the greater ecosystem they're part of. If birds don't eat a monarch and don't throw up, they don't learn that that is a toxic thing to eat. I don't know what that means if monarchs were to disappear and birds no longer recognize red foods as being something that makes them ill. So it doesn't kill the bird, it just makes them sick. That's how they learn that they don't want to eat those. So mostly we want to encourage nature to do it out in the nature. Sometimes I've related it to you don't bring in a raccoon, rear it out, and then let it go again, that it makes it domestic and it gets used to humans in a different way. Of course, insects aren't quite that cerebral. I don't think they'll train, but if you can let them do it out in the nature, that's going to be the best place for our insects to be thriving.
I did try rearing in a cage last year, and it was fun and instructive to watch that process. But it is best to keep the cage in the shade and outside. I had it under the overhang. A person could have it in a screened in porch too. But they did do studies and found that those monarchs that were reared did not make it to Mexico in as great a proportion as those that were just wild. So you're right. It is best to leave them in nature where you can. And
Mhm.
now we have another question here. You mentioned the rusty patch bumblebee, Minnesota state bumblebee, but they're endangered. Are they coming back at all? Is anything being done to help them?
Yes, we one of my favorite things is being on the team with every one of you, that we continue to be stewards of land. We will do our best to continue to put more resources out for bumblebees, for all of them. And the rusty patch is an endangered species. It's disappeared from the spots I've seen them. I know there's a lot of great people working on the problem, working on research. I didn't have it with today because there are some plants that have been dubbed super plants for bumblebees. I think I mentioned a few that are pretty solid for bumblebees. So yeah, we keep managing the landscape. We keep trying to support garden centers and gardeners that are reducing or eliminating pesticides. We're putting more flowers and diversity out for them to eat. Land use changes have been very hard on bumblebees. It used to be one of the most common bumblebees, and I don't know all the effects, but I know the less chemicals we use and the more flowers we plant, the better they'll be doing. Clean water is another big deal, that if we have a healthy environment, it can continue to support multiple layers of these healthy environments.
Thank you. We have another question here about paper wasps. Sometimes they'll make them under your overhang, maybe right above your front door. And when the nest is small and they're creating their nest, the person is asking if it's okay to spray it with water. This person has done it and observed that the nest fell apart, and then she didn't have to spray it with poison at night. What do you think of that technique?
I think that's brilliant. And especially, I know I even like weeding better in the spring. I've been excited to get and play in the dirt. Spring is a great time to watch for those wasps to put a nest in a spot that is going to be not ideal. So yeah, I think water is a great idea. I've used a broom to knock it down again when they're small and there's only one or two defending the nest, maybe four. But once those nests get big and you can see more of them coming, that's when you may want a professional. It's not as safe to be manipulating it. But yeah, when they're really small, hosing them off, that's brilliant, knocking them down. But catching them before they're too many is great.
We had planted a lot of angelica by our gazebo. It really attracted the paper wasps, and you'd be sitting there and they'd be running back and forth. And finally, I observed there was a huge nest under the overhang. They had made themselves quite at home, and then we had to get a professional in to take that down because it was beyond our ability. And now we have another question here. Someone is asking, what is the name of the most common bumblebee in the Twin Cities? This person sees only one type of bumblebee on their flowers. What do you think that might be?
I have a suspicion that it is Bombus bimaculatus, which will have one yellow band and then sort of two spots on the second band. That one's pretty common. Bombus vagans is a common one. It'll have one band of yellow, and the rest of the abdomen will be black. Now, those are two that are pretty popular.
In our garden, we have what is the largest bumblebee in Minnesota. Plant a lot of gladiolas, and they get into those just fine. And I've always wondered, where are they nesting? I think bees nest in the ground mostly, but I've never seen them coming or going. Could they fly distances from elsewhere, or how are these making homes in our garden?
So bumblebees don't fly very far. I think it may be a mile. Of course, the range would probably be a mile to 4 miles. If resources are slim, they're going to have to fly farther to get them. Bumblebees tend to be pretty close to where they're nesting. So presumably there's great habitat that have bumblebee nests in it near your gardens. The largest bumblebee that I know of is called Pennsylvanicus. It's huge. First, I get surprised by how large the queens are in the spring, and then you see littler and littler ones depending on nectar flow. They'll have some small daughters. And then Pennsylvanicus is a little later season, so they won't be the first queens out in the spring. And they are at times maybe a good 3 inches long. And even some of the workers are that large. So that one kind of gets exciting to see because they're even that much larger. What I'm aware of is bumblebees do prefer nesting in the ground. In fact, a few years in a row, I must have had a rodent burrow be abandoned. I think I had Bombus vagans living in it, and I saw where the hole was, and so I would see the workers leaving, coming and going. And then that nest finished up, and then a Pennsylvanicus moved in, and so it had another whole colony grow and hopefully thrive and then complete its season.
Now, we do have a lot of voles and mice in our garden, so perhaps we do have some abandoned rodent holes that they are using. Now, we have another question here. Several years ago, legislation was introduced to have pollinator plants along national freeways to assist with the migration of particularly monarch butterflies. Was this ever implemented, and does it seem to be helping?
I really like the idea because it's a connected corridor. So the idea that 35W got planted from Texas to Minnesota, that corridor would be all plants. The complication that I anticipate is it's not enough just because birds and plants follow the Mississippi or follow a highway doesn't mean that is the only place they're going. And because Iowa is so heavily managed by humans, specifically corn and soy, that doesn't leave enough habitat for the rest of those insects. So if they're not following the 35W corridor, we want to see more floral resources throughout. So I think it was a really good idea, a place to start, an idea of connectivity, of having floral resources all the way up and down for them to make it. That's just one part of the team that we need to be to make sure that we can have our insects survive our needs and wants as well.
Great. So I would like to thank Jessica for coming today and the Federated Garden Clubs of Minnesota, the Edina Garden Council, and the Kelodale Garden Club. Thanks our audience for taking part in Miss Miller's timely presentation and for doing your part to encourage pollinators in your garden. Thank you, Ms. Miller, for the excellent program, which will be a great help to the health of our ecosystems in our gardens, as well as our natural areas. Within about a week, this program will be posted on the Edina Garden Council's website, where it can be viewed by any members of the public who are not able to attend today. This recording will now end. Thank you for coming.